They say fate has a twisted sense of humor. But I never believed it until the night an alpha assassin showed up at my cabin with orders to kill me and ended up stealing my heart instead. My name is Arden, and this is the story of how the man sent to end my life became the reason I finally started living. I'd been hiding in the deep woods for 3 years, ever since the massacre that took my pack and left me as the sole survivor. The cabin I'd built with my own hands was miles from the nearest settlement, surrounded by ancient pines and protected by traps that would stop anyone stupid enough to come looking for me. I thought I was safe. I thought I was hidden. I thought wrong. The scent hit me first, carried on the evening wind as I sat by my fire cleaning the rifle I'd taken from the last bounty hunter who'd tried to claim me. Alpha. Pure, undiluted alpha pheromones that made my omega instincts scream warnings even as something deeper in my chest responded with unwanted recognition. This wasn't like the others who'd come before, rough men driven by greed and violence. This was something else entirely. I moved quickly, dousing the fire and grabbing my weapons, every sense on high alert. 3 years of surviving alone had honed my reflexes to razor sharpness, turned me from the soft omega I'd once been into something harder, more dangerous. I positioned myself behind the reinforced door, rifle ready, and waited. The footsteps that approached were almost silent, barely disturbing the forest floor. Professional. Whoever this was, they knew what they were doing. When the knock came, it was soft, almost polite, so unexpected that I nearly pulled the trigger from pure surprise. "I know you're in there," a voice called out, deep and rich with an accent I couldn't place. "My name is Elias. I'm not here to hurt you." The lie was so obvious it was almost insulting. Men didn't track me to the middle of nowhere for friendly conversation. But there was something in his voice, a weariness that matched my own, that made me hesitate. Funny way of showing it, I called back, not moving from my position. Most people who aren't here to hurt me don't sneak up on my cabin in the middle of the night. A soft laugh reached me through the door, and against all logic, I felt something flutter in my chest. When was the last time I'd heard genuine laughter? When was the last time I'd had a conversation that wasn't a negotiation for my life? "Fair point," the voice said. "But I figured if I'd approached during the day, you'd have shot me before I got within 100 yards. At least this way we can talk. Talk. As if we were old friends catching up instead of predator and prey circling each other in the darkness." But something about his tone made me curious despite myself. I'd learned to read people's intentions from their voices, and this Elias didn't sound like the others who'd come for me. He sounded tired, almost reluctant. "What do you want?" I asked, finger still on the trigger. "To see you," he said simply. "Face to face. Just once." The request was so strange, so different from the usual demands to surrender or threats of violence, that I found myself considering it. 3 years of isolation had worn on me more than I cared to admit. 3 years of speaking to no one but myself, of jumping at every shadow, of living like a ghost in my own life. Against every instinct screaming at me to stay hidden, I found myself opening the door. The man standing on my porch took my breath away. Tall and lean with dark hair that caught the moonlight, he had the kind of sharp, dangerous beauty that belonged in fairy tales about dark princes and forbidden love. But it was his eyes that held me frozen, gray as storm clouds and filled with something I couldn't name, something that looked almost like recognition. We stared at each other in silence, and I felt the world shift around us. This wasn't how these encounters were supposed to go. I was supposed to be fighting for my life, not standing here feeling like I'd been waiting my entire existence for this moment, for this man. "You're younger than I expected," he said finally, and his voice was softer now, almost gentle. "You're not what I expected at all," I replied, and it was true. Every bounty hunter, every assassin who'd come for me had been cut from the same cloth. Brutal, greedy, seeing me as nothing more than a payday. This man looked at me like I was a person, like I mattered. "May I come in?" he asked, and the courtesy was so unexpected that I stepped aside before I could think better of it. Elias moved into my cabin with fluid grace, his eyes taking in the sparse furnishings, the weapons mounted on the walls, the life I'd built in isolation. When his gaze returned to me, There was something like sadness in it. "You've been alone a long time," he observed. "Alone is safe," I said automatically, the response I trained myself to believe. But standing here with him, breathing in his scent and feeling the warmth of another person's presence in my space, alone suddenly felt like the loneliest word in any language. "Is it?" he asked, and the question hit deeper than it should have. "When was the last time you spoke to another person? Really spoke, not just negotiations or threats?" The answer was 3 years, but I wasn't about to admit that weakness to a man who tracked me across half the continent. Instead, I deflected. "Why are you here, Elias? And don't say to talk. Men like you don't find men like me for friendly conversation." Something flickered across his features, gone too quickly to identify. "Men like me. Killers," I said bluntly. "I can smell the blood on you, see it in the way you move. You're here for the bounty on my head, aren't you?" Elias was quiet for a long moment, his gaze never leaving mine. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I was supposed to be, past tense, as if something had changed between his arrival and this moment, standing in my cabin with the firelight playing across his features. "What changed your mind?" I asked, though part of me was afraid of the answer. He took a step closer, and I should have backed away, should have reached for one of the weapons within arm's reach. Instead, I stood frozen as he raised his hand and traced the line of my jaw with gentle fingers. "You," he said simply. "Everything about you." The touch sent electricity through my entire body, awakening something I'd thought died with my pack 3 years ago. I caught his wrist, meaning to push him away, but instead found myself holding on, feeling the steady pulse of his heartbeat beneath my fingers. "You don't know me," I whispered, but even I could hear how weak the protest sounded. "I know enough," he said, his thumb brushing across my cheekbone. "I know you've survived things that would have broken most people. I know you're stronger than any Omega I've ever met. I know that you're beautiful, and that you've been alone too long." Before I could respond, before I could think of all the reasons this was a terrible idea, he leaned down and kissed me. It was soft, tentative, nothing like the brutal claiming I might have expected from an alpha. Instead, it felt like a question, like he was asking permission I wasn't sure I was ready to give. But my body responded before my mind could catch up, lips parting under his as 3 years of loneliness and longing crashed over me like a wave. When we finally broke apart, both of us were breathing hard, and I could see my own surprise reflected in his eyes. "I should go," he said, but made no move to leave. "You should," I agreed, but my hands were still tangled in his shirt, holding him close. Instead of leaving, he kissed me again, deeper this time, and I felt the last of my resistance crumble. This was madness, kissing a man who'd been sent to kill me, feeling safe in the arms of someone who represented everything I'd been running from. But madness had never felt so much like coming home. When we broke apart this time, Elias rested his forehead against mine, his breathing as unsteady as my own. "I can't do this," he whispered, and I wasn't sure if he meant he couldn't kill me or couldn't kiss me. Maybe both. "Then don't," I said, surprising myself with the invitation in my voice. He pulled back to look at me, searching my face for something I couldn't name. "Arden," he said, and my name sounded different in his voice, softer somehow. "You don't understand what you're asking." "I understand that for the first time in 3 years, I don't feel like I'm just surviving," I said, the admission torn from somewhere deep inside me. "I understand that you were sent here to end my life, but right now, you're the only thing making me feel alive." The conflict in his eyes was obvious, duty warring with something else, something that looked dangerously like longing. Finally, he stepped back, creating space between us that felt like a physical ache. "I need time to think," he said, "about all of this." I nodded, not trusting my voice to remain steady. Of course, he needed time. This whole situation was insane, two enemies finding something like attraction in the space between violence and survival. "There's a clearing about a mile north of here," I said finally. "If you want to find me tomorrow, I'll be there at sunset." It was a leap of faith, telling him where I'd be, making myself vulnerable to someone who could still decide to collect the bounty on my head. But something about Elias made me want to take that risk, to believe that the gentleness I'd seen in his eyes was real. He nodded and moved toward the door, pausing at the threshold to look back at me. "Arden," he said, and there was something like promise in his voice. "Tomorrow." After he left, I sat by the rebuilt fire and tried to process what had just happened. Every rational part of my brain screamed that I was being foolish, that I should pack up and disappear deeper into the wilderness before he could change his mind about letting me live. But a larger part, the part that had been slowly dying during 3 years of isolation, whispered that maybe this was worth the risk. I didn't sleep that night, mind racing with possibilities and fears in equal measure. When dawn finally broke, I went through the motions of my usual routine, checking traps and gathering firewood. But my thoughts kept returning to gray eyes and gentle hands and the way my name had sounded in his voice. As the day wore on, I found myself questioning whether the whole encounter had been some elaborate hallucination brought on by too much solitude. But when I touched my lips, I could still feel the memory of his kiss, still taste the promise of something I'd never dared hope for. Sunset couldn't come fast enough. I reached the clearing early, positioning myself where I could see anyone approaching while still having escape routes if this turned out to be a trap. But when Elias emerged from the tree line, he was alone, moving with the same careful grace that had marked his approach the night before. "You came," he said, and there was relief in his voice that matched my own. "So did you," I replied, stepping out from my concealment. We stood facing each other across the small meadow, two predators caught in a moment of vulnerability. In the golden light of the setting sun, Elias looked less like a killer and more like something from a dream, beautiful and dangerous and entirely too appealing for my peace of mind. "I thought about what you said," he told me, closing the distance between us with slow, measured steps, "about feeling alive for the first time in years. And I know the feeling," he said, reaching out to touch my face again, that same gentle caress that had undone me the night before. "I've been dead inside for so long I'd forgotten what it felt like to want something besides the next job, the next target." His thumb traced across my lower lip, and I had to close my eyes against the intensity of the sensation. "What do you want now?" "You," he said simply. "I want you, and I want to forget about bounties and contracts and all the reasons this is impossible." When I opened my eyes, he was watching me with an expression so tender it made my chest ache. "For how long?" "I don't know," he admitted. "Maybe just tonight. Maybe longer. I've never done this before, Arden. I've never wanted someone enough to walk away from everything else." The honesty in his voice broke something open inside me, some last barrier I'd been clinging to in the name of self-preservation. I reached up to cover his hand with mine, pressing his palm more firmly against my cheek. "Then let's find out together," I said, and watched something bright and fierce kindle in his eyes. This time, when he kissed me, there was nothing tentative about it. His mouth claimed mine with a hunger that spoke of his own long years of loneliness, his own desperate need for connection. I kissed him back with equal fervor, pouring 3 years of isolation and longing into the contact. When we broke apart, both of us were trembling with the force of what was building between us. Elias pulled me closer, his arms wrapping around me like he was afraid I might disappear, and I let myself melt into his embrace for the first time since my pack's destruction. "Come back to the cabin with me," I whispered against his ear, and felt him shudder in response. The walk back was charged with anticipation, every brush of our hands sending sparks through my nervous system. By the time we reached my door, I was practically vibrating with need, 3 years of forced celibacy and emotional isolation combining into something that felt almost overwhelming. Inside the cabin, Elias seemed to sense my nervousness because he slowed down, gentling his touches as he drew me toward the bed I'd built in the corner. "We don't have to do anything you're not ready for," he said, his voice rough with desire but sincere in its offer. Instead of answering with words, I started unbuttoning his shirt, my fingers clumsy with want and the unfamiliarity of undressing another person after so long alone. He caught my hands, stilling them, and I looked up to find him watching me with an expression of such tender concern that it nearly brought tears to my eyes. "I'm ready," I said, and meant it. "I've been ready for longer than I care to admit." What followed was a slow exploration of skin and sensation, hands mapping the geography of scars and muscle, mouths tasting and claiming and worshipping. Elias touched me like I was something precious, something to be savored rather than conquered, and I responded with a passion I'd thought lost forever. When he finally moved over me, his body covering mine in the lamplight, I felt complete for the first time in 3 years. This wasn't just physical need being satisfied. It was soul-deep recognition, the missing piece of myself I hadn't even realized I'd been searching for. "Are you sure?" he asked one last time, positioned at my entrance but waiting for my explicit consent. "I've never been more sure of anything," I gasped, and pulled him down into another kiss as he slowly, carefully joined our bodies together. The sensation was overwhelming after so long without intimacy, pleasure and connection flooding my system until I could barely think. Elias moved with the same careful control he'd shown since arriving at my cabin, reading my responses and adjusting his rhythm to match what I needed. When release finally crashed over me, it felt like dying and being reborn in the same instant, my body arching under his as waves of sensation rolled through me. Elias followed moments later, my name falling from his lips like a prayer as he buried his face in my neck. Afterward, we lay tangled together in my narrow bed, skin cooling in the night air as our breathing slowly returned to normal. I traced patterns on his chest, marveling at the solid reality of another person in my space, in my bed, in my life. "I should probably ask your real name," I said eventually, the absurdity of the situation finally hitting me. "Since we just did that, and I still don't know if Elias is actually what you're called." His chest rumbled with quiet laughter. "It's real. Elias Thorne, at your service." He pressed a kiss to the top of my head. "Though I suspect my services are no longer the ones I was originally hired to provide." "Definitely not," I agreed, tilting my head up to look at him. In the lamplight, he looked younger, the hard edges of his face softened by satisfaction and something that might have been happiness. "No regrets?" he asked, and I could hear the vulnerability beneath the casual question. "None," I said firmly. "You? Only that it took me 32 years to find you," he replied, and the sincerity in his voice made my heart skip a beat. We talked through the night, sharing pieces of our histories in the intimate darkness. I learned that Elias had been an assassin for over a decade, taking contracts from people with enough money to afford his particular skills. He'd never failed to complete a job, never walked away from a target once he'd accepted the commission. Until me. I told him about my pack, about the night they'd been slaughtered by hunters who saw omegas as trophies to be claimed or killed, about the 3 years I'd spent running, fighting, surviving on my own in a world that saw my very existence as an affront to the natural order. "You're the strongest person I've ever met," he said after I finished my story, his arms tightening around me protectively. "What you've survived, what you've built here, it's incredible." "I don't feel strong," I admitted. "Most of the time I feel like I'm barely holding together." "Strength isn't about not feeling broken," Elias said quietly. "It's about continuing to fight even when you are. You've been fighting for 3 years, Arden. That's not weakness, that's heroism." His words settled something inside me that I hadn't even realized was unsettled, some fundamental question about my own worth that I'd been carrying since the night my world ended. In his eyes, I wasn't a victim or a fugitive or a problem to be solved. I was someone worth fighting for, worth protecting, worth loving. The thought of love should have terrified me, but wrapped in Elias's arms with dawn breaking outside my windows, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. We woke late the next morning, bodies entwined and sunlight streaming through the gaps in my crude shutters. For a moment, I panicked, thinking it had all been a dream, that I'd wake up alone as I had every morning for 3 years. But then Elias stirred beside me, his arm tightening around my waist as he nuzzled into my neck, and I relaxed into the solid reality of his presence. "Morning," he murmured against my skin, his voice rough with sleep and sending shivers down my spine. Morning, I replied, turning in his arms to face him. In the daylight, he was even more beautiful, dark hair mussed from sleep and gray eyes warm with affection as they focused on my face. Sleep well? He asked, pressing a soft kiss to my forehead. Better than I have in years, I admitted, and it was true. For the first time since my pack's death, I'd slept deeply and dreamlessly, safe in someone else's presence. We made love again in the morning light, slower and more exploratory than the night before, taking time to map each other's bodies and learn what made the other gasp and arch and plead for more. When we finally dragged ourselves from bed, the sun was well past its zenith. I made breakfast while Elias examined my defenses, his professional eye cataloging the traps and weapons I'd accumulated over 3 years of paranoid preparation. His approval of my precautions felt like validation, confirmation that my survival instincts weren't just paranoia but necessary adaptations to a hostile world. You've done well here, he said, joining me at the small table I'd built near the fireplace. Most people wouldn't last a week in conditions like this, let alone 3 years. Most people haven't had the motivation I've had, I replied, serving him eggs from my small flock of chickens and bread baked in the Dutch oven. That was one of my few concessions to civilized life. We ate in comfortable silence, and I found myself studying his face, memorizing the details in case this was all I got. One night, one morning, one perfect interlude before reality crashed back down around us. As if reading my thoughts, Elias reached across the table to take my hand. What are you thinking about? This, I said, gesturing at the space between us. What happens now? Whether you disappear back to wherever you came from and I go back to being alone. Is that what you want? He asked, his thumb stroking across my knuckles. No, I said without hesitation. But what I want and what's practical aren't usually the same thing. Elias was quiet for a moment, staring down at our joined hands. When he looked up, there was something resolute in his expression that made my heart race. I was contracted to kill you, he said slowly. But the person who hired me doesn't know I've found you yet. As far as they're concerned, I'm still tracking you through the wilderness. How long before they expect results? A few weeks, maybe a month if I claim you're particularly elusive. He paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. Long enough to figure out what we want to do about this. The fragile, impossible thing growing between us. The connection that neither of us had been looking for but both of us seemed desperate to protect. What are our options? I asked, though part of me was afraid to hope there were any. I could report back that I lost your trail, that you've moved on from this area, Elias said. It would buy us time, maybe years before they send someone else. And you? What happens to your reputation when you fail to complete a contract? His smile was sharp and not entirely pleasant. Let me worry about that. I've been in this business long enough to know how to manage my professional relationships. The casual way he dismissed what must be serious professional consequences told me more about how he felt than any declaration of love could have. He was willing to sacrifice his career, his reputation, possibly his safety, for the chance to explore what was happening between us. You'd do that? I asked. Risk everything for someone you've known for less than 24 hours? I'd do that for you, he said simply. I've spent 15 years taking lives, Arden. I'd like to try spending some time creating something beautiful instead. The conversation that followed was practical and terrifying and full of possibilities I'd never dared imagine. We talked about what it would mean for him to stay, at least temporarily, about the adjustments we'd both need to make to share the space I'd designed for solitary survival. More importantly, we talked about what we wanted from each other, what we were hoping to build in the space between his old life and my isolated existence. I don't know how to be in a relationship, I admitted as we planned how to expand my cabin to accommodate 2 people. I was barely an adult when my pack died, and everything since then has been about survival, not connection. I don't either, Elias said. I've never stayed anywhere long enough to form attachments. Never let anyone get close enough to matter. We'll figure it out together. The next few weeks were an exercise in adaptation and discovery. Elias proved surprisingly handy with construction, helping me add a proper bedroom and expand the kitchen to accommodate 2 people. He also upgraded my defenses, his professional paranoia complementing my survival instincts to create something approaching a fortress. But more than the physical changes, we were learning each other's rhythms and needs. I discovered that Elias was an early riser who preferred to start the day with quiet activity, checking our perimeter while I tended to the animals. He learned that I needed space to process emotions, that crowding me when I was overwhelmed would only make me retreat further. We had our first real fight 3 weeks after he'd arrived, a stupid argument about hunting territories that escalated into something much deeper. I accused him of trying to control me, of treating me like a client rather than a partner. He accused me of pushing him away every time we got close, of using my trauma as an excuse to avoid real intimacy. We both said things we regretted, words sharp enough to cut deep and leave scars. I stormed out to the farthest edge of my territory and spent the night in a tree, miserable and convinced I'd ruined the best thing that had ever happened to me. I returned to the cabin the next morning expecting to find it empty, sure that Elias had come to his senses and decided I was more trouble than I was worth. Instead, I found him sitting at our table with coffee and the kind of serious expression that meant he had things to say. "We need to talk," he said without preamble. I sat across from him, bracing for the conversation where he told me this wasn't working, that he was leaving, that I was too damaged for real love. Instead, he reached across the table and took my hands, his grip warm and steady and reassuring. "I'm sorry," he said, "for pushing when you needed space, for making you feel controlled when you need freedom. I'm still learning how to care about someone without trying to manage them." "I'm sorry too," I said, relief flooding through me at his words, "for pushing you away when I got scared, for using my past as a weapon when I felt cornered. I'm still learning how to let someone care about me." What followed was the most honest conversation we'd had yet, laying bare our fears and insecurities and the ways our respective traumas made intimacy feel dangerous. We talked about boundaries and needs, about how to fight fair and how to repair the damage when we inevitably hurt each other again. "I love you," Elias said as the conversation wound down. "I know it's too soon and too complicated and probably too dangerous for both of us. But I love you, Arden. And I want to figure out how to make this work." "I love you too," I replied, the words feeling strange and wonderful on my tongue. "I've been afraid to say it, afraid that admitting it would make it real enough to lose." "We might lose it anyway," he said honestly. "The world we live in isn't kind to people like us, to love like this. But I'd rather risk losing you than never have tried to keep you." That night, we made love with a desperation that spoke to how close we'd come to losing each other over our own fears and miscommunications. Afterward, as we lay tangled together in the bed we'd built together, I felt something settle into place that I hadn't even realized was missing. This was what home felt like. Not a place, but a person. Not safety from the world, but someone to face the world with. The real test of our relationship came 2 months later, when the past finally caught up with both of us. I was checking the snares on the eastern edge of my territory when I caught a familiar scent on the wind. Human, but wrong somehow, carrying the artificial edge that came from chemical enhancement. Hunters, the same kind who destroyed my pack, who'd spent 3 years tracking me through the wilderness. I made it back to the cabin in record time, bursting through the door to find Elias cleaning his weapons at our table. He looked up at my panicked entrance, immediately alert. "What is it?" "Hunters," I gasped, still breathing hard from my sprint home. "At least 3, maybe more. Enhanced. They're maybe an hour behind me." Elias was on his feet instantly, his relaxed domestic demeanor transforming into something hard and dangerous. This was the killer I'd first met, the predator who'd tracked me across half the continent. "How long since you've dealt with hunters?" he asked, moving efficiently around the cabin to gather ammunition and weapons. "Not since I came here," I admitted. "I thought I'd lost them when I went to ground." "Someone gave them your location," Elias said grimly. "The same someone who hired me, probably. They must have gotten impatient waiting for results." The implication hit me like a physical blow. This was my fault, the consequence of Elias choosing me over his contract. If he'd killed me as hired, these hunters would never have been sent as backup. "I'm sorry," I said, guilt and fear churning in my stomach. This is because of me, because you didn't finish the job. Elias stopped what he was doing and crossed to me, his hands framing my face with gentle firmness. No, he said, his voice intense. This is because someone thinks they have the right to hunt you like an animal. This is because the world is full of people who see omegas as property to be claimed or destroyed. This is not your fault, Arden. His certainty helped settle some of my panic, but the guilt remained. What do? We fight, he said simply. Together. You know this territory better than anyone, and I know how hunters think. We use every advantage we have. The next few hours were spent in frantic preparation, setting additional traps and creating escape routes, planning contingencies for various scenarios. Elias's professional expertise combined with my intimate knowledge of the local terrain to create a defensive strategy that might actually work. As the sun began to set, we took positions in the trees overlooking the most likely approach to our cabin. The waiting was the worst part, adrenaline and fear making every shadow look like a threat, every sound like an approaching enemy. When they finally came, there were 4 of them, moving in the practiced formation of experienced hunters. Enhanced humans, as I'd suspected, their sense artificial and wrong, their movements too fast and precise to be entirely natural. They were good, but Elias was better. The first hunter went down to one of my pit traps, enhanced reflexes not quite fast enough to avoid the camouflaged hole. The second fell to Elias's rifle, a perfect headshot from 200 yards that dropped him instantly. The remaining 2 adapted quickly, splitting up and using the forest cover to approach from different angles. This was where my knowledge of the terrain became crucial, guiding Elias through paths that would give him clean shots while keeping us mobile and harder to track. The third hunter almost got me, appearing from behind a deadfall I thought was secure. I managed to get my knife up in time to block his first strike, but he was stronger and faster than any natural human had a right to be. We grappled in the underbrush, his enhanced strength slowly overwhelming my natural omega agility. Elias's shot took the hunter's head off, literally, the high-caliber round turning skull and brain into a red mist that painted the nearby trees. I scrambled away from the corpse, shaking with adrenaline and the near miss of my own death. The fourth hunter had used the distraction to circle around, getting close enough to our cabin to threaten our home base. Elias and I converged on his position from different angles, catching him in a crossfire that left him nowhere to run. "Who sent you?" Elias demanded, his rifle trained on the hunter's center mass. "Go to hell," the hunter spat, reaching for something at his belt. Elias didn't hesitate, his shot taking the man in the chest before he could trigger whatever suicide device he'd been reaching for. We checked the body carefully, but found nothing that would identify who had hired him or how they'd found my location. "It's not over," Elias said as we stood among the bodies of our enemies. "Whoever sent them will send more when these ones don't report back." "Then we run," I said, surprised by how calm I sounded. "We take what we can carry and disappear." "Are you sure?" he asked. "This place, you built it with your own hands. It's your home." I looked around at the cabin and clearing that had been my sanctuary for 3 years, then at the man who'd become my world in just a few short months. "Home isn't a place," I said, taking his hand. "It's you. As long as we're together, I'm home." We spent that night packing the essentials, burning what we couldn't carry and erasing what traces we could of our presence. By dawn, we were gone, disappearing into the deep wilderness like ghosts. The months that followed were hard, constantly moving, never staying in one place long enough to feel safe or settled. But they were also some of the happiest of my life, because I wasn't alone anymore. Every hardship was shared, every small joy doubled by having someone to experience it with. Elias proved to be an ideal traveling companion, his skills complementing mine to create a partnership that was greater than the sum of its parts. He could read people and situations with the expertise of someone who'd spent years studying human nature for professional purposes. I could read the land and weather, finding shelter and resources in places that looked barren to less experienced eyes. More importantly, the constant proximity deepened our emotional connection in ways that staying in one place never could have. When you're traveling with someone under difficult conditions, You see them at their best and worst, in moments of strength and vulnerability that reveal their true character. I learned that Elias sang when he thought no one was listening, old songs in a language I didn't recognize that spoke of loss and longing and the kind of deep sadness that comes from a life lived in the shadows. I learned that he was afraid of thunderstorms, a childhood phobia that no amount of professional training had been able to overcome. He learned that I talked to myself when I was working through problems, carrying on entire conversations with invisible opponents as I planned our route or considered our options. He learned that I had nightmares about my pack's death, but that being held afterward helped ease the terror that would otherwise keep me awake for hours. We learned each other's bodies with the intimacy that comes from sharing a bedroll night after night, making love under the stars and finding pleasure and comfort in each other, even when we were dirty and exhausted and living like animals. 6 months after fleeing our cabin, we finally found what we were looking for. A settlement so remote it barely appeared on any map, populated by people who asked no questions and minded their own business. It was the kind of place where fugitives and outcasts could disappear, where being different was less important than being useful. We bought a small house on the outskirts of town with money from Elias's previous contracts, a modest place that nonetheless felt like a palace after months of sleeping rough. For the first time since leaving our cabin, we had privacy, security, the possibility of building something lasting. "What do you want to do now?" I asked Elias one evening as we sat on our small porch watching the sun set over the mountains that surrounded our new home. "This," he said, pulling me closer. "Exactly this. Build a life with you, grow old together, maybe help some other people who are running from things they can't control." The idea appealed to me more than I'd expected. We had skills that could be useful to others in similar situations, knowledge that could mean the difference between life and death for people fleeing persecution or violence. "A sanctuary," I said, the idea forming as I spoke. "For omegas, for people who don't fit the world's expectations, for anyone who needs a place to heal and figure out what comes next." "I like it," Elias said, "though we should probably get established ourselves before we start taking in strays." We spent the next year doing exactly that, building our relationship and our new life with the same careful attention we'd once devoted to survival. We learned to be domestic together, sharing household chores and making decisions as a team, navigating the small compromises and adjustments that come with building a life with another person. I started a small garden, something I'd never had the security to attempt during my years of running. Elias took odd jobs around town, his various skills making him useful for everything from construction to conflict resolution. We became part of the community in ways that neither of us had ever experienced before. More importantly, we became secure enough in our relationship to start planning for a future that extended beyond mere survival. We talked about the sanctuary we wanted to build, about the people we hoped to help, about the kind of legacy we wanted to leave behind. "I never thought I'd live long enough to think about legacy," Elias admitted one night as we lay in bed discussing our plans. "In my line of work, you assume each job might be your last. Planning for the future felt like inviting disappointment." "What changed?" I asked, though I suspected I knew the answer. "You," he said, pressing a kiss to my temple. "You made me want to live, not just survive. You made me believe that we could have something worth protecting, worth building, worth passing on to others." The first person we helped was a young Omega named Marcus who showed up at our door bleeding and half dead, pursued by alphas who saw his rejection of their advances as a personal insult. We patched him up, hid him until his pursuers moved on, and helped him get established in a town 3 days' travel away where he could start over. Word spread, as it does in communities of people who live on the margins. Within 2 years, we were receiving a steady stream of visitors. Omegas fleeing forced matings, alphas who refused to conform to society's violent expectations, humans who'd been enhanced against their will and were now considered abominations by both sides. We never turned anyone away, though we were careful about security and screening. Elias's professional paranoia served us well, helping us identify potential threats while still maintaining the openness that made our sanctuary effective. Not everyone stayed. Most people just needed a safe place to rest and recover before moving on to whatever came next in their lives. But some remained, adding their skills and stories to our growing community of misfits and refugees. Marcus stayed, becoming something like a younger brother to both of us. Dev, a human teenager whose parents had kicked him out for refusing enhancement, appointed himself our unofficial chronicler, documenting the stories of everyone who passed through our doors. Sarah, an alpha who'd walked away from a life of privilege rather than participate in her family's Omega trafficking operation, used her business skills to help us establish sustainable funding for our operation. 5 years after fleeing our cabin in the woods, we were running a legitimate nonprofit organization, recognized by the few government entities that cared about protecting people like us. We had a compound instead of a single house, dormitories and workshops and training facilities that could accommodate dozens of people at a time. But the heart of it all was still the relationship between Elias and me, the love that had grown from that first impossible moment when he chose to kiss me instead of kill me. Any regrets? I asked him one evening as we walked the perimeter of our compound, a habit left over from our more dangerous days. About walking away from my old life? About choosing you over everything I'd built before? He considered the question seriously, as he always did. Never. Not for a single moment. Even when things get complicated. When we have 30 people depending on us and not enough resources to go around. Especially then, he said, stopping to pull me into his arms. Do you know what my life was like before you? Empty, violent, meaningless. I took lives for money and told myself it was just business, that I was providing a service in a world that needed people like me. He paused, looking out over the compound where lights were beginning to come on as people settled in for the evening. Now I save lives, he continued. I help people find hope when they thought they had none left. I wake up every morning next to the person I love most in the world, and I go to sleep every night knowing that we've made the world a little bit better just by existing in it. We make a good team, I agreed, settling into his embrace. The best, he said, and kissed me with the same tenderness he'd shown that first night in my cabin, when he'd chosen love over duty and changed both our lives forever. As we walked back toward our house, I reflected on the journey that had brought us here. From the broken Omega hiding in the wilderness to the man who helped run a sanctuary for society's outcasts. From the assassin who'd never failed a contract to the protector who'd never met a lost soul he wouldn't help. We'd both been transformed by love, but more than that, we'd learned to transform others through the love we'd found together. Every person who passed through our doors was a little bit safer, a little bit more hopeful, because two people had chosen each other over fear and impossibility. What are you thinking about? Elias asked as we reached our front porch. Us, I said. How we got here, where we're going, how grateful I am that you're terrible at your old job. He laughed, the sound warm and rich in the evening air. I was excellent at my old job. I just found something better to be excellent at. That night, as we made love in the bed we'd shared for 5 years, I marveled at how it still felt new, how the passion between us had only deepened with time and familiarity. Elias touched me like he was still discovering me. Like every caress was a gift he was grateful to give and receive. Afterward, as we lay tangled together in the darkness, he traced patterns on my skin and spoke into the quiet. I have something to tell you, he said, and there was something in his voice that made me pay attention. What is it? I got a call today, from my old handler, the one who manages contracts for people like I used to be. He paused, his hand stilling on my chest. There's a new bounty out on you. A big one. Ice flooded my veins. 3 years of safety and security suddenly feeling fragile as spun glass. How big? Big enough to attract attention from people who make my old skills look like amateur hour, he said grimly. Someone really wants you dead, Arden, and they're willing to pay whatever it takes to make it happen. We lay in silence for a moment, processing the implications. Our sanctuary, our community, our life together, all of it was built on the foundation of our safety. If that was threatened, everything else became vulnerable. What do we do? I asked, though part of me already knew the answer. We run, Elias said. We take whoever wants to come with us and we disappear. Find someplace even more remote to start over. Again. As many times as it takes, he said fiercely. I'll spend the rest of my life running with you if that's what it takes to keep you safe. The prospect should have been terrifying, the idea of abandoning everything we'd built to return to a life of constant movement and uncertainty. Instead, I found myself almost relieved. Running with Elias had been some of the happiest months of my life, when it was just the two of us against the world, when our love was tested and proven stronger than any external force. "When do we leave?" I asked. "Soon," he said. "But first, we make sure everyone here has somewhere safe to go. We don't abandon our people, even to save ourselves." The next few weeks were a flurry of activity, quietly preparing for evacuation while maintaining the normal rhythms of sanctuary life. Some of our residents chose to come with us, forming a convoy of vehicles and supplies for the journey to whatever came next. Others made their own plans, using skills and connections they developed during their time with us to find safety elsewhere. Marcus chose to stay with us, as I'd known he would. Dev and Sarah as well, both of them too invested in our mission to walk away when things got dangerous. A dozen others made the same choice, creating a small but dedicated community of people willing to risk everything for the chance to continue our work. The night before we left, Elias and I stood on the porch of the house where we'd been so happy, looking out over the compound that had been our life's work for 5 years. "Second thoughts?" he asked. "None," I said, and meant it. This place was never the important part. The important part is what we do, who we help, the love we share. That comes with us wherever we go. We drove away before dawn, a convoy of vehicles carrying people and supplies toward an uncertain future. In the rearview mirror, I watched our sanctuary disappear behind the mountains, but I felt no sadness, only anticipation for whatever came next. Because I wasn't running alone anymore. I was traveling with my family, my chosen pack, the people who'd become home to me in ways that no place ever could. And at the center of it all was Elias, the man who'd been sent to kill me and had instead taught me how to live. The road ahead was uncertain, probably dangerous, definitely difficult. But we'd face it together, and that made all the difference. Love had saved us both, and now we'd spend the rest of our lives using that love to save others. It was, I thought as our convoy disappeared into the wilderness, exactly the life I'd never dared dream of, but somehow deserved after all. Thank you for joining us on this journey from violence to love, from isolation to community, from surviving to thriving. Remember that love can find you in the most unexpected places, that choosing each other is always worth the risk, and that sometimes the person sent to destroy you might actually be the one meant to save you. If this story touched your heart, let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more tales of love conquering impossible odds. But our story doesn't end there. The road ahead would test everything we'd built together, challenge our love in ways we never imagined, and ultimately prove that some bonds are strong enough to survive anything the world throws at them. 3 months into our journey, traveling through the remote mountain passes that would take us to our new sanctuary location, we encountered something none of us had expected. Another convoy, clearly in distress, surrounded by the aftermath of an attack. Bodies littered the mountainside, both human and enhanced, the acidic smell of burned flesh mixing with the metallic scent of spilled blood. At the center of the carnage sat a single overturned vehicle, smoke rising from its engine as 2 figures huddled behind it for protection. "Could be a trap?" Marcus said from the passenger seat of our lead vehicle, his hand automatically moving to the weapon at his side. "Could be," Elias agreed, but I could see him studying the scene with the practiced eye of someone who'd orchestrated plenty of ambushes in his former life. "But look at the burn patterns, the way the bodies are distributed. This was a running battle, not a planned engagement. Someone got jumped and fought their way out. I made the decision that would change everything. We helped them." Dev, monitoring our radio communications from the technical vehicle, immediately protested. "Arden, we can't risk the convoy for strangers. We have 24 people depending on us to get them safely to." "We help them," I repeated, cutting him off. "That's who we are. That's what we do. We don't leave people to die just because it's inconvenient or dangerous." Elias squeezed my hand, his support warming me even as I saw the concern in his eyes. "Everyone stays alert," he called over the radio. "Weapons ready, escape routes planned. But we go in." The 2 survivors turned out to be a father and son, both Omegas, fleeing from what the older man described as a breeding program that had been masquerading as a legitimate Omega protection service. Thomas was maybe 50, graying at the temples but still strong, with the kind of controlled desperation that spoke of a man who'd seen too much and lost even more. His son Jamie couldn't have been more than 16, thin and traumatized and carrying the particular kind of damage that comes from being treated like property rather than a person. They had trucks full of us, Thomas explained as our medic Sarah treated the shrapnel wounds on his arms. Dozens of Omegas, told we were being relocated to a safe zone. Took us 3 days to realize we were being transported to auction houses, sold to the highest bidders like livestock. How did you escape? Elias asked, his voice gentle but professional. Some of the older ones we'd been planning since the second day, Thomas said. Waited until we were going through terrain like this, where the trucks had to slow down. Cost us 20 good people, but Jamie and I made it out. I looked at the boy, who hadn't spoken since we'd found them, just stayed pressed against his father's side, like he was afraid someone might try to separate them again. The protective fury that rose in my chest was almost overwhelming. You're safe now, I told them both. We're going somewhere they'll never find you, where people like us can live without fear. People like us? Thomas asked, and I realized he was cataloging the sense and dynamics of our group, trying to figure out who we were and whether we could be trusted. Refugees, Elias said simply. People who don't fit the world's expectations, who've been hunted or used or thrown away because we refuse to be what others want us to be. Thomas studied Elias with sharp eyes, clearly recognizing the controlled danger in my partner's bearing. You're the one they call the ghost, he said finally. The assassin who disappeared 3 years ago after failing to complete a high-profile contract. I felt Elias tense beside me, his hand moving instinctively toward his weapon. Our carefully constructed new identities were supposed to protect us, but apparently Elias's reputation had followed us further than we'd hoped. That depends, Elias said carefully. Why would that matter to you? Thomas surprised us both by smiling. Because the contract you failed to complete was worth more money than most people see in a lifetime. The kind of money that gets offered when someone really, truly wants a person dead. And if you walked away from that kind of payday. He looked between us, understanding dawning in his eyes. You must have found something worth more than gold. That night, as our enlarged convoy made camp in a defensible position among the rocks, Thomas sought me out as I sat by one of the small fires we'd allowed ourselves. I need to ask you something, he said, settling down beside me with the careful movements of a man whose injuries were still healing. The place you're taking us, this sanctuary you've built, what do you do about the ones who can't be saved? The question hit deeper than I'd expected. What do you mean? Jamie? Thomas said simply, and I looked across the camp to where his son sat alone, staring into the flames with the 1,000-yard stare of someone who'd seen too much. What they did to him, what he experienced in those trucks before we escaped, it broke something inside him. He hasn't spoken more than a few words since it happened. Barely eats. Doesn't sleep unless he's so exhausted he can't stay awake. I watched the boy for a moment, recognizing something of my own early days of trauma in his rigid posture and haunted eyes. He's not broken, I said finally. He's protecting himself the only way he knows how. I was the same way after my pack died. After I spent months running and hiding and convinced that everyone I met was trying to hurt me. What changed? Thomas asked, though his eyes had already found Elias across the camp, where my partner was checking our perimeter defenses with his usual methodical precision. Love, I said simply. Not the kind that tries to fix you or make you forget what happened, but the kind that sees your wounds and doesn't flinch away. The kind that gives you space to heal while making sure you know you're not alone. Thomas nodded slowly. Jamie had a mate, he said quietly. Another boy his age. Sweet kid named River who'd been captured the same day we were. They put them in separate trucks after they figured out the boys were bonded. Said bonded pairs were worth more when they were desperate to get back to each other. The casual cruelty of it made my stomach turn. What happened to River? Don't know, Thomas said, and the pain in his voice was raw and fresh. Jamie keeps asking, keeps hoping we'll find him somehow. But the trucks that didn't crash, they kept going. Could be anywhere by now. I looked back at Jamie, understanding now why the boy seemed so lost, so disconnected from everything around him. He wasn't just traumatized by his captivity. He was grieving, mourning a bond that had been torn away from him when he needed it most. "We'll help him," I promised Thomas. "However long it takes, whatever he needs. And if there's any way to find River, any trail to follow, we'll do that too." The gratitude in Thomas's eyes was almost overwhelming. "Why?" he asked. "You don't owe us anything. We're strangers who've made your journey more dangerous just by being here." "Because that's what family does," I said, echoing words Elias had spoken to me years earlier. "We take care of each other, especially when the world has failed us." Integration Jamie and Thomas into our group proved to be more challenging than I'd anticipated. Thomas adapted quickly, his mature pragmatism and survival skills making him a valuable addition to our convoy. But Jamie remained isolated, going through the motions of travel and camp life while clearly being somewhere else entirely in his mind. It was Dev who made the first breakthrough, approaching the boy not with sympathy or attempts to draw him out, but with simple companionship. Dev would sit near Jamie during meals, not talking, just being present. He'd include Jamie in small tasks like gathering firewood or checking equipment, treating him like a contributing member of the group rather than a victim to be pitted. Slowly, over the course of several weeks, Jamie began to respond. Nothing dramatic, just small signs that he was starting to engage with the world again. He'd make eye contact when someone spoke to him, nod in response to questions, occasionally offer help with camp chores without being asked. The real breakthrough came the night we were attacked. We'd been making good time through a particularly treacherous stretch of mountain road when our scout, a quiet woman named Lynn who joined us at our last sanctuary, reported movement ahead. Multiple vehicles, moving in formation, clearly trying to set up some kind of roadblock or ambush. "Hunters?" I asked, though I was already reaching for my weapons. "Worse," Lynn said grimly. "Military contractors. The kind of professional soldiers who get hired when someone has serious money to spend." Elias was already moving, his old instincts taking over as he coordinated our defensive response. "They'll have the road blocked ahead and behind," he said tersely. "Classic pincer movement. Our only option is to go up." Going up meant abandoning our vehicles and climbing into the rocky terrain above the road, carrying what supplies we could manage while leaving behind everything else we'd accumulated over months of careful preparation. It meant exposing our people to pursuit in terrain where our enemies would have every advantage. It also meant survival because fighting professional soldiers on their terms in their chosen battlefield was just elaborate suicide. The evacuation went smoothly at first, our people moving with the practiced efficiency of a group that had learned to trust each other's expertise. But as we climbed higher into the rocks, it became clear that we were being herded, driven toward what was probably another trap waiting above. That's when Jamie surprised everyone. The boy who'd barely spoken in weeks suddenly grabbed Dev's arm, pointing toward a section of cliff face that looked identical to every other piece of stone around us. When Dev looked confused, Jamie actually spoke for the first time since joining our group. "Cave," he said, his voice hoarse from disuse. "Hidden. River showed me places like this, how to find them when you need to hide." Elias examined the area Jamie had indicated and found what none of the rest of us had seen. A narrow entrance concealed behind a fall of loose rock, leading to a cave system that extended deep into the mountain. It was exactly the kind of shelter we needed, defensible and hidden, with what appeared to be multiple exits. "Good eyes," Elias told Jamie as he helped guide our people into the cave. "Your mate taught you well." The compliment brought the first genuine smile I'd seen from the boy since we'd found him. "River was better at this stuff than anyone," he said quietly. "Always said that being small and quiet was an advantage if you knew how to use it." We spent 3 days in those caves, waiting for the search teams to give up and move on. During that time, Jamie began to open up, sharing stories about River and their life before the capture, talking about the skills his lost mate had taught him and the dreams they'd shared about finding a place where they could be safe together. "River would have liked this," Jamie said one evening as we sat around a small fire deep in the cave system, our voices echoing softly off the stone walls. The adventure, the traveling, meeting new people, having a purpose bigger than just surviving. Tell us about him, Sarah said gently, and Jamie's face lit up in a way that transformed his entire appearance. What followed was the story of a young love that had blossomed in the most unlikely circumstances. Two frightened Omega teenagers who'd found strength and hope in their connection to each other. River had been captured 6 months before Jamie, taken from a settlement raid that had destroyed his community. But instead of letting despair consume him, he'd spent those months learning everything he could about survival, about reading people and situations, about finding opportunity in the midst of hopelessness. He said we were going to escape together, Jamie continued, his voice growing stronger as he talked. He had it all planned out, routes mapped, supplies hidden, contacts in settlements where we could disappear. He just needed to wait for the right moment. When we were being moved through terrain he knew how to navigate. The convoy attack, I realized. That was his plan, wasn't it? The reason the escape attempt happened when it did. Jamie nodded. River convinced the others to make their move when we were going through the mountains, said it was our best chance. But when the fighting started, we got separated. I saw his truck flip, saw smoke, but then Dad was pulling me away and we had to run. The pain in his voice was raw and immediate, the kind of grief that comes from not knowing, from having hope and fear tangled together until they become indistinguishable. We'll find him, Marcus said firmly. When we get to the new sanctuary, when we have resources and contacts again, we'll put out word. Track down survivors from the other trucks. Follow every lead. And if he's... Jamie couldn't finish the sentence, but we all understood. Then we'll know, Thomas said, putting his arm around his son. One way or another, we'll find out what happened, and we'll help you deal with whatever that means. It was the kind of promise that could easily become an impossible burden, but looking around at the faces of my chosen family, I knew we'd keep it. This was what we did, what we were. People who'd learned that love was worth any risk, any sacrifice, any amount of effort required to protect it. When we finally emerged from the caves, the search teams were gone, leaving behind only the scattered debris of our abandoned vehicles and supplies. We were on foot now, carrying everything we owned on our backs, but somehow that felt like freedom rather than loss. The final month of our journey tested us in ways that convoy travel never could have. Moving on foot with a group our size required different skills, different strategies, different kinds of trust and cooperation. But it also brought us closer together, forged bonds that would have taken years to develop under easier circumstances. Jamie proved to be invaluable as a scout and pathfinder, his natural talents enhanced by the training River had given him. Dev took charge of morale, using his natural humor and optimism to keep spirits up during the hardest days. Sarah managed our limited medical supplies with the efficiency of someone who'd learned to work miracles with almost nothing. Thomas became my unofficial second-in-command, his steady presence and practical wisdom helping me make the dozens of daily decisions required to keep our group moving safely toward our destination. And Elias, my beautiful, dangerous partner, was everywhere at once, scouting ahead, watching our backs, handling the security concerns that kept the rest of us safe. But more than the practical support, what sustained me during those difficult weeks was the knowledge that I wasn't carrying the burden alone. Every decision was made in consultation with people I trusted. Every risk was shared among people who'd chosen to be there. This was what leadership was supposed to feel like, not the isolation of command, but the strength that comes from being part of something larger than yourself. We reached our destination on a morning when the early autumn air carried the promise of winter, the smell of pine and snow and the kind of clean emptiness that spoke of places where civilization hadn't yet learned to tread heavily. The valley we'd chosen was perfect for our purposes. Remote, defensible, with fresh water and good hunting, far enough from any settlement to ensure privacy, but close enough to trade routes to make occasional contact with the outside world possible. More importantly, it felt like home from the moment we crested the ridge and looked down at the meadows and forests that would become our new sanctuary. "It's beautiful," Sarah said, speaking for all of us. "It's ours," I replied, and felt something settle into place that had been displaced since we'd fled our last sanctuary. We were home again, ready to start building something new. The first winter was the hardest. Building shelter for 24 people before the snow fell required every skill and resource we could muster, pushing us to our limits and beyond. But by the time spring arrived, we had the foundations of something that could become permanent. Solid buildings, cleared fields ready for planting, workshops and storage areas that could support not just our current group but the refugees we hope to help in the coming years. More importantly, we had become a community in the deepest sense of the word. The hardships of the journey and the challenges of building our new home had welded us together into something stronger than the sum of our individual parts. Jamie had flourished during those months, his natural talents finding full expression as he took charge of scouting and perimeter security. The lost, traumatized boy who'd barely spoken when we found him had grown into a confident young man whose smile came easily and whose presence made everyone around him feel safer. But he still asked about River every time we made contact with the networks of refugees and outcasts that formed our intelligence system. Still held on to hope that his lost mate was alive somewhere. Still searching for the person who'd taught him to survive and to love. The answer came in our second spring at the new sanctuary, carried by a trader who dealt in information as much as goods. River was alive, he told us, but he was being held in a facility that specialized in training rebellious Omegas, breaking their spirits and turning them into compliant property for wealthy buyers. It's not good news, the trader warned. That place, it's run by people who have connections all the way up to the government level. They don't just break bodies, they break minds. Most people who go in there don't come out as themselves. Jamie went very still when he heard this, his face cycling through hope and despair so quickly it was painful to watch. How long has he been there? He asked quietly. 6 months, maybe more, the trader said. But kid, you have to understand, 6 months in that place is like 6 years anywhere else. Whatever he was when he went in, he's not going to be the same person when he comes out. That doesn't matter, Jamie said, and there was steel in his voice that reminded me of myself at his age, facing impossible odds with nothing but determination and love to sustain me. He's my mate. Whatever they've done to him, whatever he's become, I'll help him remember who he really is. The conversation that followed was one of the most difficult we'd ever had as a community. The facility where River was being held wasn't just heavily guarded. It was politically protected, run by people with enough influence to make problems disappear permanently. A rescue attempt wouldn't just risk the lives of everyone involved. It could expose our sanctuary, bring down the kind of attention that would destroy everything we'd built. We can't do it, Marcus said, voicing what several others were thinking. It's not that we don't want to help, Jamie, but the risk is too great. We have 30 people here now, all of them depending on us to keep them safe. So we sacrifice one person to protect the rest? Jamie asked, and there was challenge in his voice that reminded me uncomfortably of arguments I'd had with myself during my years of hiding. What happens when it's one of us being held? When it's Sarah or Dev or Arden? Do we write them off too because rescue is inconvenient? It was Elias who ended the debate, speaking with the quiet authority that came from years of experience with impossible situations. We do it, he said simply, not because it's smart or safe or strategically sound, but because it's right, because that's who we are, and if we stop being who we are just to stay safe, then we're not worth saving anyway. The planning took weeks, drawing on every skill and contact we'd accumulated over years of operating on the margins of society. Elias reached out to former colleagues who owed him favors, people who moved in the same shadows where he'd once worked. Dev used his technical expertise to gather intelligence on the facility's security systems and daily routines. Sarah prepared medical supplies for treating someone who'd been systematically tortured and psychologically conditioned. But the real breakthrough came from Jamie himself, who'd spent months studying everything he could learn about the people who ran the facility and the methods they used to break their victims. River's smart, he said during one of our planning sessions. Smarter than they probably give him credit for. If there's any part of him left intact, he'll be looking for opportunities, waiting for the right moment to act. We don't need to rescue someone who's helpless. We need to give him the tools and opportunity to rescue himself. The plan we eventually settled on was elegant in its simplicity, relying on misdirection and timing rather than brute force. Elias would use his old contacts to create a distraction, a series of attacks on the facility's peripheral operations that would draw security away from the main compound. Meanwhile, a small team would infiltrate the facility itself, not to extract River directly but to provide him with weapons, supplies, and intelligence about escape routes. If River was still himself, if he was still capable of independent action, he'd take advantage of the chaos to make his own escape. If he wasn't, if 6 months of conditioning had truly broken him, then at least he'd have the option of dying as himself rather than living as someone else's property. It was a terrible gamble, risking everything on the hope that love and determination could survive systematic torture and psychological conditioning. But it was also the kind of gamble that had defined every important decision in my life, from trusting Elias that first night to building the sanctuary where we now lived. The night before the mission, Jamie sought me out as I sat by the river that ran through our valley, watching the stars reflect in the dark water. "I need to ask you something," he said, settling down beside me with the easy grace he'd developed over months of hard physical work. "Anything," I said, and meant it. "If this goes wrong, if we all die trying to save him, was it worth it?" His voice was steady, but I could hear the fear underneath, the knowledge that tomorrow might be the last day for all of us. I thought about the question, about the risks we were taking and the lives we might lose. "Do you remember what you told me about River?" I asked. "About how he made being small and quiet into an advantage." Jamie nodded. "Love is like that," I said. "The world sees it as weakness, something that makes you vulnerable and stupid and easy to manipulate. But when it's real love, the kind that survives everything the world throws at it, it becomes the strongest force there is. It makes you willing to risk everything for someone else, to become more than you thought you could be." I looked up at the stars, thinking about all the impossible things love had made possible in my own life. Is it worth dying for? Maybe. But more importantly, it's worth living for, worth fighting for, worth building something beautiful that outlasts any individual life. "River used to say something like that," Jamie said quietly. "He'd say that loving someone wasn't about keeping them safe. It was about making them brave enough to be who they really were, no matter what the world thought about it." "Sounds like a wise young man," I said. "Sounds like someone worth saving." The rescue mission launched before dawn, 3 separate teams moving to their positions while the rest of us waited at the sanctuary for word of success or failure. I'd wanted to go with them, but Elias had convinced me that my responsibility was to our community, to be ready to evacuate everyone if the mission failed and brought reprisals down on our heads. The waiting was torture. Every minute stretched into hours as I imagined everything that could go wrong. But as the sun climbed toward its zenith, Dev's voice crackled over our radio system with the words I'd been praying to hear. "Package secured. Coming home." They arrived that evening, a convoy of vehicles carrying not just our rescue team but nearly 24 liberated prisoners, people who'd been held at the facility for various lengths of time. River was among them, but the young man who climbed out of the lead vehicle was barely recognizable as the person Jamie had described. He was thin to the point of emaciation, marked with scars that spoke eloquently of systematic torture. Worse were his eyes, vacant and carefully neutral in a way that suggested he'd learned to hide his thoughts and feelings so completely that even he might not be able to find them anymore. But when he saw Jamie, something flickered behind that careful emptiness. Recognition, hope, fear, love, all tangled together in an expression so complex it was painful to witness. Jamie approached him slowly, hands visible, voice soft and non-threatening. "River," he said. "It's me. It's Jamie. You're safe now." River's response was barely audible. "Jamie's dead," he said in a voice like broken glass. "They told me, showed me pictures, said if I was good, if I learned to be what they wanted, maybe I could join him." "I'm not dead," Jamie said, close enough now to reach out but not yet touching. "I'm right here, River. I'm real, and I'm alive, and I never stopped looking for you." What happened next was something I'll remember for the rest of my life. River's carefully constructed walls crumbled all at once, months of suppressed emotion and desperate hope breaking free in a way that was beautiful and heartbreaking and absolutely raw. He collapsed into Jamie's arms, sobbing with the kind of desperate relief that comes from giving up a burden you've carried so long you forgot it was weighing you down. They held each other there in the dust of our courtyard, two young men who'd found their way back to each other against impossible odds, and I felt tears streaming down my own face as I watched love prove once again that it was stronger than anything the world could devise to destroy it. The healing process was long and difficult. River had been conditioned to distrust his own thoughts and feelings, trained to second-guess every impulse and desire until he barely knew what he wanted or needed. But with Jamie's patient support and the care of our entire community, he slowly began to reclaim himself. It wasn't a smooth process. There were setbacks and breakdowns, days when River couldn't remember why he was fighting to get better or what kind of future was worth the effort of healing. But there were also breakthroughs, moments when his personality would shine through the conditioning, when he'd laugh at one of Dev's jokes or offer a strategic insight that reminded everyone why Jamie had fallen in love with him in the first place. Watching their relationship rebuild itself was like watching a masterclass in what love could accomplish when it was patient and selfless and completely committed to the other person's well-being. Jamie never pushed, never demanded more than River could give, but he also never stopped believing that the person he loved was still there underneath all the damage. "Some days I don't know who I am anymore," River confided to me one evening as we worked together in the garden, his hands steady as he transplanted seedlings with careful precision. "That's okay," I said. "After what you've been through, it would be strange if you did know. The important thing is that you get to decide who you want to become. No one else gets to make that choice for you ever again." "Jamie remembers who I was before," River said quietly. "Sometimes I think he loves that person more than who I am now." I stopped what I was doing and looked at him directly. "River, Jamie spent months planning a rescue mission that could have gotten everyone in this community killed, just for the chance to give you back your freedom. That's not the love of someone clinging to a memory. That's the love of someone who sees exactly who you are right now and chooses you anyway." The insight seemed to settle something in River's mind, and for the first time since his rescue, I saw him truly smile. He did do that, didn't he? Risked everything for someone who might not even exist anymore. "He risked everything for you," I corrected. "The real you, whoever that turns out to be." 2 years after River's rescue, Jamie and River were bonded in a ceremony that brought together not just our sanctuary community, but representatives from settlements and refuges across the region. It was the kind of celebration that reminded everyone present why we fought so hard to create spaces where love could flourish without apology or explanation. Standing with Elias as we watched the two young men pledge their lives to each other, I felt a deep sense of completion that had nothing to do with my own happiness and everything to do with witnessing love triumph over the forces that tried to destroy it. "Think they'll make it?" Elias asked quietly, his hand finding mine as the ceremony concluded and the celebration began. "Look at them," I said, watching Jamie and River move through the crowd of well-wishers, their faces bright with joy and their hands never letting go of each other. "They've already survived everything the world could throw at them. This is the easy part." That night, as our community celebrated around bonfires that turned the valley into something magical, Elias and I found ourselves alone on the ridge overlooking our home. 7 years had passed since that first night when he'd come to my cabin to kill me and ended up saving my life instead. 7 years of building something beautiful from the ashes of our individual traumas, of learning that love multiplied when it was shared rather than hoarded. "Any regrets?" I asked, echoing the question I'd posed years earlier. About walking away from a lucrative career as an assassin to become the co-founder of a refugee sanctuary? Elias pretended to consider it seriously. About choosing love over duty, family over profit, building something instead of destroying it? "That's the one," I said, smiling at his mock-serious tone. "Never," he said, pulling me closer. "Not for a single moment. Do you know what my life would have been like if I'd completed that contract? If I'd killed you that first night? Tell me." "Empty," he said simply. "I'd have collected my fee, taken the next job, continued the same cycle of violence and isolation that had defined my existence for 15 years. I'd have died alone and unmourned, leaving nothing behind but a reputation for efficiency and a bank account full of blood money." He gestured toward the valley below us, where the lights of our community glowed warm against the darkness. Instead, I get to wake up every morning next to the person I love most in the world. I get to spend my days helping people find safety and hope instead of delivering death and despair. I get to be part of something that makes the world better just by existing. We make a good team, I said, settling into his embrace. The best, he agreed, and kissed me with the same tenderness he'd shown that first night, when he'd chosen love over duty and changed both our lives forever. Looking down at our sanctuary, at the lights that represented dozens of lives we'd helped save, at the community we'd built from nothing but hope and determination, I felt overwhelmed by gratitude for the journey that had brought us here. We'd started as natural enemies, predator and prey brought together by circumstance and kept together by choice. We'd become partners, then lovers, then the foundation of something larger than either of us could have imagined alone. And we were still growing, still changing, still discovering new ways to love each other and the community we'd created. This wasn't an ending, I realized. This was just the beginning of whatever came next, whatever challenges and opportunities the future would bring. What are you thinking about? Elias asked, following my gaze across the valley. Tomorrow, I said. Next year. The next group of refugees who'll need help. The next impossible rescue mission. The next chance to prove that love is stronger than fear. Looking forward to it, he said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. So was I. After all, we had work to do, lives to save, love to spread to every corner of a world that desperately needed to remember what it meant to choose connection over isolation, hope over despair, building over destroying. And we had each other, which made everything else possible. Thank you for staying with us through this extended journey from assassination to sanctuary, from solitude to community, from surviving to thriving. Remember that love can find you in the most unexpected places, that choosing each other is always worth the risk, and that sometimes the person sent to destroy you might actually be the one meant to save you. Your story of love and resilience is worth telling, worth fighting for, worth building something beautiful around. Until next time, keep choosing love, keep building hope, and never forget that you deserve happiness as much as anyone else in this world.